This is FE Peer Review. The date is January the 28th, 2024. Talking points. I know nothing for sure. This is going to be a very quick one. I saw a poll and went ahead and answered it. Does evolution support intelligent design? I answered no. Then I glanced down at the comments. Somebody wrote, an intelligent designer could set everything in motion and then just let everything evolve on its own. Certainly not a new argument. I've heard that before. I'm sure all of you have. I responded, could be. That's not how the Bible, the Quran, and other religious traditions describe things, but it could be. On the other hand, is there any actual evidence that is what happened? Or are we just musing about possibilities? The person who wrote the original comment responded, we will never be able to prove that anything exists or has ever existed. The only thing that you can prove to be real is your conscience. Anything besides that is the outside world, real or not, is it impossible to prove forever. English might not be his first language. I don't know. I'm not going to harangue him about grammar. That's not the point. But again, that's probably an argument you've heard. I've forgotten who the philosopher was that first talked about perception and that all we think we know is what we perceive, and we are not really capable of anything, of knowing anything other than what we perceive, and that, in fact, we don't even really experience the outside world. We experience a kind of a reflection of it on our own body through our sense organs as with information processed by our brains. We don't see the world, we see our eyeballs, basically. That's the argument. I've forgotten who it was that first put that out there, but it's been a long time since I studied that. Anyway, I responded to the person, and I wrote, I first heard that philosophical argument 40 years ago, actually 41 years ago, when I was studying philosophy and comparative religion at a Jesuit university. After 2 years there, I realized I wanted to do other things with my life. All I know is what I perceive, and in fact my own perceptive abilities are flawed, so none of us can be sure we know anything about reality. It's the kind of thing that gives a philosopher a boner, but it does nothing to move society forward. And the fact is, society has moved forward. We've conquered diseases, we've created a cheap, reliable, and abundant food supply, we've developed instant communication across the globe, we're even beginning to explore beyond the borders of Earth. So apparently we've figured something out about the real world. We wouldn't be able to do these things successfully and predictably if we hadn't. Well, I was going to leave it there, and I had even recorded the end, the final greeting, but I've decided now I better do just a little bit more here, make at least a small effort. So I did what we all do when we want to start doing deep research. I opened up a bunch of tabs in my browser, and in the first one, I asked Google, which philosopher said we only know our own consciousness? I did say consciousness, not conscience, because I think that the person writing that comment probably meant consciousness. And then, of course, yes, solipsism. So it brought me to the Wikipedia page for solipsism, which is the philosophical idea that only one's mind is sure to exist. As an epistemological position, solipsism holds that knowledge of anything outside one's own mind is unsure. The external world and other minds cannot be known and might not exist outside the mind. Frankly, I'm not even sure we can be sure about our own minds, but that's beside the point. And then I scrolled down and looked at a little bit of this all through. Oh yeah, okay, there's various people. Now, I don't think we ever covered this Greek philosopher, Gorgias. That's quite a name. But of course, we spent way too much time on Descartes. Lots of time on Descartes, so he may have been who I was remembering when I was discussing this earlier. Descartes describes how Psychological concepts are accomplished by making an analogy with our own mental states, in other words, by abstraction from inner experience. And this view, or some variant of it, has been influential in philosophy since Descartes elevated the search for incontrovertible certainty, that's what we're all trying to get, to the status of the primary goal of epistemology, which also elevating epistemology to first philosophy. Okay, that's fine. And then my eye dropped down to George Berkeley, and I thought, oh, that's a name I remember we discussed, and I couldn't remember anything about him. George Berkeley's arguments against materialism in favor of idealism provide the solipsist with a number of arguments not found in Descartes. While Descartes defends ontological dualism, thus accepting the existence of the material world, as well as immaterial minds and God, Berkeley denies the existence of matter, but not minds, of which God is one. I thought, he's a very, bourgeois, well-fed looking fellow in this painting here. Let's look at it more about him. So I went to the page on George Berkeley here. And he started out in Ireland. He started out in Ireland. Born at his family home, Dysart Castle, the son of William Berkeley, a cadet of the noble family of Berkeley, whose ancestry can be traced back to the Anglo-Saxon period. He got well educated and ended up going off to the Americas. Marriage and America, 1728. So this was some 30, 70, 40, almost 50 years before the independence. So America was still very deeply entrenched as a colony of Great Britain. And there's his very charming looking, very typical, highly prosperous home of the period. That is the home of a very rich person, that house there. And that's where he lived in the Americas. That was in Rhode Island. It says here, he lived at the plantation while he waited for funds for his college to arrive. The funds, however, were not forthcoming, and so he ended up returning to the UK. Well, I guess why I looked into that at all was because I thought, this very well-fed looking gentleman here thinks reality doesn't exist, and I'll bet you that he was waited on hand and foot by servants for his whole life. He probably had people there to help him with his clothes in the morning and to bring him a hot tub of water to bathe in, and he may have had people taking out his bowls of shit and dumping it so that he wouldn't have to deal with it. And he was sitting around philosophizing that reality doesn't exist. What can I say? So that's philosophy for you. I'm sure there's a lot of value in it. I know there's a lot of value in it, but there's also a whole lot of that sort of thing. I think I did the right thing to go off and study engineering. I'm not fit for this kind of stuff. By the way, many of those people that probably served George Berkeley hand and foot while he lived in comfort in that lovely house in Rhode Island, they were, many of them, probably enslaved people. Rhode Island, I believe, was one of the earlier states to end slavery. Nonetheless, that was a good, well more than 50 years after George Berkeley was musing about the unreality of reality. I'm looking at the Wikipedia page that gives a little short summary of the history of slavery in Rhode Island. 1784, the legislature passed a compromise measure. Children of slaves born after March 1st were to become apprentices, and over the course of a generation, it was to gradually disappear. But that was 1784, which was some 50, 60 years after George Berkeley was doing his thing. I'm not blaming him for anything. He was just living the same life as other people in his class lived at the time. I'm just musing on his philosophical musings while being served by slaves. That's all. I just wanted to share that little talking point with you. May stimulate some discussions of your own, either here in the comments or, I don't know, at home with your significant other or with your friends at the pub. Anyway, you all have a wonderful day. and a wonderful week. And I look forward to talking with you all again soon. Bye-bye.